The metal gunstock's chill crept through Sergeant Elias Thorne's gloves. The fog was thick, a wet white shroud which enveloped Sector 7, consuming all sounds and every speck of light. This was his 11th night on his own patrol. 11 nights in near full silence, a silence so heavy and stifling that it made his ears ring. Elias gripped his modern rifle much tighter, his eyes strained, seeking to pierce the grey mist. He was weary, a fatigue that had seeped so very deep right into his bones. And then he heard it again. A remote sound, one that did not fit in here, the dull boom of cannon fire, as though filtered through the ages, followed by a metal-on-metal clash, a chaotic sound of blades and not of bullets. And most frightening of all, there were shouts in a language he couldn't grasp, in words which had long since been dead. He stopped and held his breath. The wind. It must be the wind. The wind blowing through the ruined trenches, creating weird, eerie sounds. Or maybe exhaustion. Command had said so. Sleep deprivation and stress may play tricks on a soldier's mind. Elias started to walk, the soles of his boots crushing the cold, thick mud. He was a pragmatic man, a battle-worn soldier, one who saw enough of the real horrors created by other men. He had absolutely no time for ghosts, but the whispers would not cease. They trailed him just like his shadow, weaving at the very edge of his hearing. Brief images in the corner of his eye, shadows moving where there was nothing. He often felt a sudden gust of cold air, an unfounded feeling of terror that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He had reported it. Vaguely, he could not tell his commanders that he thought he was hearing battles from the Napoleonic Wars. They'd think that he had lost his mind. "Get some rest, Sergeant," they said over the crackling radio. "It is just a symptom of combat fatigue syndrome." He had truly tried to believe it. He clung to rationality like a drowning man would cling to a piece of wood, but the fog in Sector 7 appeared to have a life of its own, and it was whispering secrets he did not wish to hear. A week later, he was no longer alone. Command had assigned him a small crew, 4 young soldiers, with eyes yet bright and not yet worn down by the grim weariness of this war. Elias felt a fleeting sense of relief. Perhaps the presence of other people would drive away these illusions. But he was wrong. Their presence merely served to amplify it. Private Miller, the youngest, most sensitive, was the very first one to break. His eyes were perpetually wide, panicked, always darting toward the shadows that the other soldiers ignored. "Sergeant," he whispered one frigid night, his voice shaking. "Can you hear that? They are talking." Elias dismissed it, but he heard it too. The sound of hooves on the muddy ground, of commands yelled out in old German or ancient French. The bad dream had now gained an audience. Things took a turn for the worse when they started finding items which shouldn't be there. While digging deeper in a modern trench, a soldier's shovel blade hit something solid. It was a lead musket ball, totally oxidized and quite misshapen. Another day, they dug up a tattered part of a uniform, its blue nearly completely faded, buried meters deep in the soil. Relics from wars long forgotten, lying right there underneath their own feet. Elias's denial began to fracture. These objects were real. They were tangible. They were proof that something was very, terribly wrong with Sector 7. The first engagement happened on a grey afternoon, when the fog was as thick as milk. They were on patrol on a low ridge, when the sound just exploded all around them. This time, it was not hazy or distant. It was right there. Musket fire roared, steel swords clashed with a deafening shriek, and the screams of hundreds of dying men echoed. And then, they saw them, faint, see-through figures of soldiers in uniforms from different ages. Napoleonic infantry with their tall hats, World War I Germans with spiked helmets, all charging at each other in a frenzied, silent battle. They ran through each other, plunging ghostly bayonets into ghostly bodies. "Get down!" Elias shouted, his reflexes overriding his disbelief. His squad dove to the ground, taking cover behind a crumbling stone wall. Though the ghosts could not touch them, their actions had consequences in the real world. A ghostly explosion from an unseen cannonball made the very ground tremble, throwing dust and rock bits into the air. Elias could feel the shock wave, an unseen pressure that was pushing down upon his chest. They cowered, besieged by a foe that did not exist, a battle that had ended centuries ago but still would not simply die. When the spectral chaos subsided and the ghosts faded back into the fog, the returning silence was more terrifying than the noise. No one said a thing. They just stared at each other, their faces white with sheer horror. Private Miller was quietly sobbing. Now there was no more space for any denial. They weren't sent to watch an empty piece of land. They had been cast into an unquiet mass grave. The squad's morale collapsed quickly. The young soldiers, once so eager, now moved like ghosts, haunted by what they had seen. The long nights were now filled with bad dreams. Miller was the worst. He lost weight, his eyes grew sunken, and he just stared into space. He muttered of the ghost soldiers, saying that they were calling his name. Elias tried to report the situation as honestly as he possibly could. The response from command was cold and distant. They spoke of mass hysteria and offered mental health counseling on their return. They were cut off, alone with their ghosts. Driven by desperation, Elias began his own investigation. He spent his few off hours poring through digital files, looking for any information on Sector 7. He found old maps, forgotten tales in local folklore. The pieces started to fall into place. Sector 7 was not just a piece of land. It was a thin place, a spot on the earth where the veil between the living world and the dead was almost non-existent. Centuries of bloodshed, brutal battles from Roman times, through the Napoleonic Wars, to both world wars, had all occurred on this very ground. The agony and sudden death of so many had stained this area, thinning the fabric of reality itself. He realized a horrifying truth. These spirits were not malicious. They were not attacking his crew. They were simply trapped, cursed to replay their last moments, an endless loop of pain and violence that never ended. They didn't even realize that they were dead. For them, the battle was still raging on. This knowledge brought no comfort, only a much deeper and more profound horror. And then, the spirits started to interact, not with hostility, but with a desperate wish to pull the living into their eternal loop. Private Miller, already made weak by his fear, became the main target. Elias would find him talking to an empty wall, answering orders no one else could hear. He began to see the ghosts not as blurry shapes, but as his own comrades, beckoning for him to join them. One afternoon, Elias saw Miller stumbling out of the trench, eyes empty, walking toward an open field. "Miller, get back here," Elias cried. He didn't hear. He was walking toward a line of ghostly French soldiers preparing for a charge. Elias lunged, grabbing Miller by the collar and tackling him to the ground, just seconds before he walked into an area known to be full of unexploded mines from an old war. Miller snapped out of it, shaking and confused, with no memory of what he had just done. He only recalled his new friends were calling for him. Elias knew he was no longer just fighting for his own mind. He was fighting for the very souls of his men. It all came to a head when they got a critical mission. Establish a long-term forward observation post. Deep within Sector 7, right at the heart of the haunting. It was a death sentence. As soon as they reached the spot, a bare hill overlooking a misty valley, all hell broke loose. Night fell, and with it came the entire armies of history. This time there were no brief images or distant sounds. Thousands, tens of thousands of ghosts filled the valley. Entire battles from different times played out at once, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of death. Roman legionaries fought with British riflemen. Prussian cavalry charged through World War I machine gun nests. The screams, the weapons, the explosions blended into one unbearable sound. A centuries-old growl of agony. Elias and his men cowered in their tiny foxhole, assaulted by a supernatural storm. The lines between past and present completely dissolved. Elias's mind was invaded. He wasn't just seeing, he was also feeling. He felt the cold steel of a Saxon's blade as it ran him through his gut. He could feel the searing burn of mustard gas as it filled the lungs of a young Canadian soldier. He experienced hundreds of deaths, each one a blinding flash of pain, terror, and the absolute, crushing despair of realizing the complete futility of their fight. He collapsed, clutching his head, screaming in silence, warm tears streaming down his face. And then, through the madness, he saw Miller. Private Miller was standing up, his eyes entirely vacant. He raised his rifle, not at the ghosts, but as if to join them. He let out a hoarse battle cry and started to climb out of the foxhole, about to charge into the ranks of a marching phantom regiment. "Miller, no," Elias roared, his voice lost in the din of the spectral battle. He summoned his last strength, lunged forward, and tackled Miller to the ground. He fought back frantically, his strength bizarre, as if fueled by the very spirits around them. Elias had to hit him in the face, a desperate blow to shock him back to reality. Miller slumped, unconscious, as Elias knelt there, panting, his body shaking, looking at the young soldier's vacant face. A terrible and profound truth dawned on him, an epiphany born of total horror. He looked out at the sea of warring souls. He looked into the empty eyes of a Napoleonic soldier as he was run through with a bayonet. He saw no malice, he saw only confusion, anguish. They were not fighting him. They were not fighting anyone in the present. They were simply fighting, because it was the only thing they had left. The fight was their coping mechanism against unending suffering, the last act seared into their souls. They didn't want to pull the living into their fight. They were desperately screaming, unconsciously, to be released from it. In a moment of quiet in the storm, Elias recalled a small detail from his research, a footnote in an old law book. It spoke of a forgotten war memorial, somewhere nearby, erected centuries ago by locals to soothe the unquiet spirits. A place said to be a focal point for the grief. As soon as dawn broke, and the ghosts retreated like the tide, Elias made a decision. He slung Miller over his shoulder, gathered his 2 other soldiers, who were shaking in a state of shock, and ordered a retreat from the observation post. He reported the mission as a failure due to overwhelming enemy morale. It was the truth, in a way. After ensuring Miller was safely evacuated by medevac, Elias did something against all the rules. He led his 2 remaining loyal soldiers back into Sector 7, not to fight, but to search. They walked for hours, using an old map Elias downloaded, going deep into a dense forest that modern military operations had overlooked. Finally, they found it. Covered in vines and moss, almost swallowed by the earth, was a simple block of stone, a war memorial with no names, no dates, just a rugged monolith, standing as a quiet witness to the horrors it had seen. Without a word, Elias slung his rifle from his shoulder and placed it at the foot of the memorial. The other 2 soldiers, understanding him without words, did the same. They stood there, 3 soldiers of the 21st century, their weapons on the ground in a symbolic truce. Elias was not a religious man, but he bowed his head. He didn't pray. He just acknowledged. He acknowledged their pain. He acknowledged their sacrifice. He acknowledged their existence. As they stood in silence, a subtle change occurred in the air. The silence was not heavy, oppressive. It became peaceful. The wind in the leaves no longer sounded like ghostly whispers. It was just the wind. The bone-deep chill seemed to lessen a little bit. Even the fog felt less suffocating. Suddenly, one of the soldiers grabbed Elias's arm, his eyes wide. Elias followed his gaze. For a brief moment, he saw them, not as frenzied warriors, but as faint shapes standing among the trees. They were no longer fighting. They were just standing, watching. Their faces were not twisted in rage, but held a deep, endless sorrow. Then, one by one, they faded, dissolving into the daylight. This time, he felt they would not be back. The battle was well and truly over. A few days later, Elias's crew was rotated out of Sector 7. The psychological toll they carried was huge, but it was a burden shared in quiet understanding. Sector 7 was still a place of deep sadness, but the violent haunting had abated. The echoes remained, if you listened closely, but they were not the screams of battle. They were a lament. Before leaving, Elias and his 2 remaining soldiers returned to the edge of the woods. They quietly gathered stones, building a small, informal cairn. A simple marker, a testament for the unquiet dead, whose war had finally found a bit of stillness. Elias looked into the fog one last time, feeling a strange and cool sense of peace. He had come to Sector 7 as a soldier. He left as a keeper of memories, forever changed by the real cost of war.